Hello, my name is Jesper. I'm the author behind J.C. SpringBourne, and I'm reading my own short stories, A Man and His Battle Unicorn. I hope a part of you will be fascinated by my stories, maybe even fascinated enough to buy them. Now, Chapter 3. A New Job. As I slowly exited the dragon pen, walking up the stairs that was expanding and contracting me, I marveled at the wondrous world. I might be dreaming, or somebody had given me some weird drugs, but I was loving it. Richard had been in the lion pen on the other side and returned up the stairs. I pointed at the lions and asked, "Are those real lions or something else?" He looked at them as he closed the gate to their pen. "Oh, they're real lions. Sometimes one of the chimeras comes visiting, but not today." A small man, perhaps a gnome, crept down the path between the two pens and crooned something I couldn't understand. His head had long, gray-brown hair, he was about my knee height, and he wore work glasses. The kind with zoom lenses on extra arms and different colored lenses. I worked in a store where half the customers don't speak English as their first language, so I was not fazed by that. Richard chirped something and added, "Speak English, my friend." The gnome nodded, touched his pendant, and said, "So you got an apprentice?" Richard shook his head. "No, he works in a store on Earth and just came to visit." The gnome looked up and down, mostly up, and then hummed, "Used to work in a store, and he is large." He looked at Richard and crooned something. Richard nodded and said, "Ask him yourself." The gnome bowed even lower than he was and hummed, "You want to work in my store?" He stepped quickly back and held up his hand in front of his face. "It is okay to say no." I kneeled down and said, "I don't know. What kind of store is it? I normally just work in a food store." I smiled at Richard, "And I guess this place has different types of food from my world." Richard nodded and explained, "It is a magic store. Gnomes make magic rings, pendants, and wands." The gnome nodded at him and elaborated, "We make magic tools, but we don't like talking with large people." He turned to Richard. The last large person stole a week's worth of gold and escaped with a dimension ring. I chuckled. "And that is part 2. I have no idea how to come home." Richard crooned to the gnome, "Show him your store. Maybe that can convince him." The gnome nodded at Richard and looked at me kneeling in front of him. I was still 2 heads taller than him. He smiled and motioned for me to follow him. We started walking out of the pet pens and into the ground of the bazaar. The gnome was short, but people still watched out for him and let him come through. There was a large troll which ignored him, and the gnome jumped to the side. It was only when the troll walked past him I noticed that he had glasses pushed up on his head. The gnome said, "Snack, he is half blind without his glasses, and mostly deaf. Just don't play poker with him." He walked to a small tent which had a red collar on the side. There was a golden pattern around the edges, and there were some stars on the side. I walked into the tent, which from the outside was maybe 3 meters wide, and walked into a room the size of a grand hall. 5 rows of stuff, some in cases and some in boxes. A few people were walking up and down the aisles, but the store was nearly empty. There were 3 suits of armor in one corner, silver, brown leather, and red. Another side had some paintings, which a young man was watching. The gnome shouted at the young man, and he walked away. The gnome said, "They always try to look into the girls' showers." I guessed what the painting were. Some kind of closed-circuit television. The gnome let me come behind the counter, and I walked past another gnome. "Somebody asked for the instructions," the gnome said, shaking his head. "It was right there on the paper." I smiled as I was led into the back room. I talked with customers all day. Old ladies who had forgotten their PIN code, people who need help finding artificial sugar, and all the other things that was standard in a human store. The gnome found a chair and sat down, which made him even shorter. I found a pillow and sat down on it, so I was as low as I could be. He shook his head and fussed all day with that question. "Does it come in red? Can you have it on Wednesday? What is the return policy?" I quoted from my store's book. "If you have the recipe and it is not broken, you can get your money back." He frowned and looked up at me. "Can people break stuff you have made?" I shook my head and explained. "I don't make it, I just sell it. And yes, things break in my world. In our world." He groaned a little. "We'd like to hire you." He looked up at me with sad eyes. "Our stuff is the best, but we don't like to speak with people." I nodded. "How can I get home? I live in another dimension, I think." The gnome rose from the chair, walked to the curtain, and looked out into the store. He hummed something to one of the other gnomes. Then he came back and sat down. Another gnome walked into the room. They crooned a little in their native language. The second gnome held out a ring and crooned in bad English. "Ring to travel there and back." I held out my hand, and he dropped the little copper ring, and then found a piece of paper which he also gave me. I found the coin Richard had given me and gave it as payment. When my grandmother gave me the gift card, I don't think she wanted me to buy a dimension-traveling ring. The gnome looked at the gold ring and then crooned something to the first gnome. The first gnome dismissed him, and he walked back out into the room. "But the ring is first payment for you to work here," the gnome explained. "You should not pay us, and that coin was way too much." I stifled a yawn and said, "Sorry, I was at work for 10 hours before coming here. My batteries are getting low." The gnome rose and said, "Travel home and think about it." I looked at the small ring and tried to get it on my finger. But the ring grew to the right size. The paper was in Mandarin, Sanskrit, or both. But after a minute, the letters changed to English. I started reading it, the gnome said. As I started reading it, the gnome said, "One-shot magic. The owner of the ring, it translates to his language." I read the command word and said, "I will be back." The ring felt warm, and the lighting in my own room was low. I have automatic lights that are turned on in the evening. Either I have not been long in the other dimension, or I had gotten myself home while being on whatever drug I have been given. That was chapter 3. I hope a part of you gets fascinated by my stories. Maybe even a part of you want to share my stories with as many friends as you have. Or else, good day, and I will read next chapter tomorrow. Good day.